Good morning, everybody. Good to
Morning,
see
Rabbi.
everybody.
Morning, Rabbi.
Morning.
We're just about ready to start.
Hi, Rabbi.
Good morning. Okay, so we're starting the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is an interesting book. It's not that long. It's 4 chapters. Fascinating story. And the reason why we're studying it now is because, first of all, thanks to Neil. That's the first reason. And the second reason is because there is a custom that some people read the book of Ruth in the synagogue on Shavuot, on the holiday of the giving of the Torah. It happens to be not a Chabad custom, but that's not because we have anything against Ruth. I think we read it the night before. In other words, when we stay up all night, part of the tikkun, part of the recitation that we study Torah on the night of Shavuot, we read the book of Ruth. We just don't read it formally in the synagogue, probably because we want to get to the cheesecake quicker. No, I'm kidding. It's just a custom. We don't do it. But Ruth, so it's been a custom for many, many generations to study the book of Ruth. Like everything else in Judaism, we know we do it. We're not sure why we do it. Meaning to say, there are multiple reasons of why, multiple reasons given for the reason for the reading of the book of Ruth. I'm going to start, I think, with 3 reasons before we get into the details. So what are the 3 reasons? 3 reasons that we read the book of Ruth. Number 1 is because Ruth was a convert. So she's a Moabite woman, and if you track the story, she decides she wants to become Jewish. She comes to Israel, and the story unfolds. Good morning, Chair. And the story unfolds. So Ruth wants to become Jewish. She wants to convert. She converts. Now, what does conversion have to do with the holiday of Shavuot? The answer, of course, is that on the holiday of Shavuot, all Jews converted. In other words, we all converted to Judaism. When did we convert to Judaism? At Mount Sinai. So at Sinai, we all become converts. And that's why we read about the fascinating story of famous convert called Ruth, and a lot of the laws of conversion, as we will discuss, are derived from the book of Ruth. So that's the first theme. The first theme is Ruth accepted the Torah, and on Shavuot we all accept the Torah. No? Okay. That's reason number 1. Reason number 2. Reason number 2 is just a practical reason. The backdrop of, this is going to interrupt a little bit. The backdrop of the book of Ruth plays out in this time of year, in the season of the harvest. A lot of the drama happens actually in the field at the harvest. And a lot of the drama is tied into the mitzvos of the harvest. What are the mitzvot of the harvest? You have to leave some of the grain to the poor. And that's how the story unfolds, where the 2 main characters, or some of the main characters, Ruth and Boaz, meet up because Ruth comes to collect the gifts of produce that were left for the poor. So to remind people that now is the season when you're going to start the harvest, to remind people to leave the gifts of produce for the poor, we read the book of Ruth. That's another reason. So far we have 2 reasons. And then finally, the 3rd reason is because Ruth becomes the ancestor, the great-grandmother of King David. So she becomes really the matriarch of the dynasty of the house of David, King David. And what does King David have to do with Shavuot? The tradition is that King David passed away on Shavuot. So to commemorate King David, we read about the story of his ancestor, his great-grandmother, Ruth, the Moabite woman. So this is an introduction of 3 reasons why we read it on Shavuot, and therefore why we're studying it in the lead up to Shavuot. Okay, fine. Now we understand. Okay, wonderful. Beautiful. Okay, now we have to get into the actual book. Before we get to the actual book, before you set out to write a book, you have to figure out what are you trying to achieve. And believe it or not, the commentaries are trying to figure out why do they write the book of Ruth? Like, why is it important? It's a wonderful story. If you want to buy the book, go buy a book. If you want to watch the movie, go make a movie. But why write a book and include it as part of the Bible? Right? The Bible has 3 parts. Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Nevi'im, the prophets, and the third part is the Ketuvim, the writings. Part of the Ketuvim is the 5 scrolls. There are 5 scrolls: scroll of Esther, scroll of Ruth. And the question becomes, why has this been written? I'm going to quote the Medrash. I'm going to read the Medrash. The Medrash says, Rabbi Zeira says, this Megillah, this scroll of Esther, does not have any laws of purity and impurity, does not have any laws of things that are prohibited or permitted. In other words, there's no law. There's no law. So why has this been written, and why has it been included in the Bible? That's the question the Medrash addresses. And the Medrash, there's really 2 answers to this question. Again, before we read the book, what we're trying to figure out is why write the book to begin with. It's a nice story, but there are other nice stories. Okay, this is becoming a tough negotiator. He wants to be bribed to go downstairs. Every day, the price goes up. Started with 1 chocolate chip. Now by now we're deep into Corona. Believe me, it's more than 1 chocolate chip. Okay, so why we write the book if there's no law, right? Torah is primarily lesson, primarily law. There's no law, there's no purity, no impurity, no prohibited, no permitted. Why is this in the Bible? So there are basically 2 reasons given in the Medrash, and what we're going to try to do is try to connect both reasons and show that there's actually, you can connect the 2. Number 1, the book of Ruth, even though there's no law, is full of morality. What's the morality? It's full of kindness. Milut Chasadim. When you trace the book, you realize that there's a tremendous theme of kindness that carries on throughout the book. And the primary kind person in the book is Ruth herself. She does kindness to her mother-in-law, and she almost selfless kindness. If you think about it, as we will trace it, you see that Ruth is a sort of the exemplifies selfless kindness to the extreme. So you see, it's not fair to say that the book of Ruth doesn't have any commandments, it doesn't have any mitzvot or any teachings. The Medrash says it does have teachings. What does it teach us? It teaches us Gemilut Chasadim. It teaches us how to perform kindness in the extreme. So that's one Medrash. Okay. Then we have another Medrash. The other Medrash says as follows. It's not clear exactly what I'm going to repeat it. I'm going to say it, and then we'll see what it means. The second Medrash says, well, we have to offer the lineage of King David. You have King David. King David is an important family in Judaism because the monarchs come from the house of David. So we need to establish the monarchy. So we need to know where the monarchy comes from. And therefore, we write the book of Ruth to tell you about the history where the king came from. Now, this is a small sentence that has a lot of tension behind it and a lot of politics behind it. I'm going to try to give a little bit of history here about what's happening with Ruth, what's happening with Moab, what's happening with the house of David, what's happening with the monarchy. It's a big problem. So what's happened? Here's the backstory. Okay, the backstory is that there's a verse in the Bible, black on white, that says as follows. It says a Ammonite, someone from the house of Ammon, from the nation of Ammon, and a Moabite, which is someone from the nation of Moab, may not join the congregation of God, which means you're not allowed to accept a convert from Ammon and Moab. You can accept a convert from all nations. Even the Egyptians, you have to wait 3 generations. All other nations you can accept, but Ammon and Moab, we cannot accept any converts from Ammon and Moab. We'll get to the reason for that in a moment, but that's the law, black on white. I don't know how you would get around that prohibition, but you'll see later. Leave it to the rabbis; they'll figure something out. So the bottom line is, we're not allowed to accept a convert from Ammon or from Moab. Now here you have a king, and the King David descends from Moab because his great-grandmother is Ruth, as we will read, a Moabite convert. So the Talmud discusses that the people who opposed King David came to the study hall one day and said, maybe King David is not a legitimate king. Why isn't he a legitimate king? Because he's not of your brethren. The Talmud says you have to accept. The verse says you have to appoint a king from your brethren, a fellow Jew. He's not a valid king. And someone responded in the study hall. He said, don't ask if he's a valid king. Ask a better question. Is he a legitimate Jew? Maybe he's not a legitimate Jew. Why isn't he a legitimate Jew? Because his great-grandmother is not Jewish. Why is she not Jewish? She converted. She converted, yes, but she converted from the land of Moab. So there's a problem here with converts from Moab, and this causes David some serious problems. Okay, so let's dig a little deeper here. What's the problem with Moab? And Ammon, for that matter. So if you go back to the Torah gives the reason. The Torah gives the reason. The Torah says the reason why Ammon and Moab are not to be accepted as converts is because Ammon and Moab, first of all, are our cousins. You know, most of the big fights you have is with family. You know, the stranger you can get along with. Family is a little more tricky. So Ammon and Moab are our cousins. They are descendants of the Lot, who's the nephew of Abraham. And a long story short, the Jewish people left Egypt, and they traveled in the desert for 40 years. At the end of the 40 years, they're already coming out of the desert, emerging from the desert, coming into civilization. And they reach out to the two neighboring countries. Today they would be in modern-day Jordan. And they say, could you give us some passage? We want to pass through. We want to cross the Jordan. We want to go into Israel. Ammon and Moab do not allow the Jewish people to cross their territory. And the verse is God is so offended. The Torah says, you know why? We cannot accept Ammon and Moab because they did not greet you with bread and water. Right? If you come to town after 40 years of traveling in the desert and you have a first cousin and your first cousin doesn't greet you with bread and water, it's terribly offensive. Okay, that's what the verse says. Now you could look at it and say, wow, the Jewish people know how to hold a grudge. Generations later, you didn't give me a tuna sandwich, and we will not accept a convert forever. But it's much deeper than that. Why is it deeper than that? If you go back to the history, what's Ammon and Moab? Their ancestor was Lot, who's Abraham's nephew. So he came with Abraham to Israel. And once they come to Israel, Lot sort of is disillusioned, and he says, I want to leave Abraham. And where does he go settle? He settles in Sodom. Okay, so he settles in the most corrupt place in the country. And Sodom, their corruption is that they don't believe in kindness. They're not allowed to feed the poor. They're not allowed to support the poor. Charity is outlawed. Charity is outlawed, and there's a death penalty for charity. So now the question becomes, what's the quintessential character of Abraham? Abraham, our ancestor, is kind. Now Lot and his family move away from the kindness of Abraham, and they go to Sodom. Now the question is, did Sodom affect them? So the fact that they don't, when generations later, when we came out of Egypt, the people could not give us a piece of bread and water, that represents that they lost all connection to the kindness of Abraham. If they lost all connection to the kindness of Abraham, then they have no redeeming factors and they cannot be included in the Jewish people. That's the history of Ammon and Moab. Okay. I hope I'm just not putting out pieces here. All the pieces of the puzzle are going to come together in just a few minutes. But don't wait. You're not going to have to wait to the end of the series. Hopefully, in a few minutes, everything will come together. Okay, now what happens is if you're the rabbis say, no. You have to read this verse literally. The verse says a Moabite and a Ammonite cannot join the congregation of God. So the rabbis say that refers specifically to males, not females. So if you're a Moabite woman, you're allowed to convert. What's the textual support? The textual proof is the verse says it in the masculine, not in the feminine. It says a Moabite and an Ammonite in the masculine. And it doesn't say it in the feminine. In Hebrew, in English, it's the same, but in Hebrew it would be Ammoni is a masculine, Ammonite would be feminine. So the verse speaks in the masculine, not in the feminine. Okay, that's the textual support. But what is the reason? Why is it that Moabites cannot become converts? The male Moabites cannot become converts, but the female Moabites can. So the rabbis have an interesting interpretation. They say, what does the verse say? The verse says that the reason why they're rejected is because they did not greet us with bread and water. Who greets people with bread and water? In other words, who's making the political decision not to greet the Jews with bread and water? So this is before women had the right to vote. I don't think anyone had the right to vote there, but the bottom line is women were not in politics, and it was not the decision of the females. It was the decision of the males. So the men were cruel. The men did not show any kindness. So the men are rejected. say the rabbis, the women are not rejected because the women are kind. Okay. So in other words, the underlying logic to allow for a female Moabite convert, which really is the underlying logic to allow for King David to be a legitimate Jew and a legitimate king. What's the underlying logic? The underlying logic is all predicated upon the fact that the Moabite men are cruel and the Moabite women are kind. Okay, what's the best proof for that? The best proof for that is Ruth, right? Because Ruth is all about kindness. So in other words, the fact that we have the story, and remember, I asked the question, why is the book of Ruth written? So the Medrash says, reason one, to teach us kindness. Reason two, to tell us about the lineage of David. Reason two and reason one are interconnected. The only way the lineage of David is legitimate is if the Moabite women are kind. So Ruth's kindness is the way of showing, exemplifying that in reality, the prohibition is specifically for the men, not for the women. And based on that, King David can be accepted as a legitimate Jew. And based on that, not only a legitimate Jew, but actually becomes the king, not just the king. There are tremendous implications here. How the Mashiach comes from the house of David, which means the family of Judaism that we believe is going to influence the rest of the world and bring peace and harmony to the world comes from David, but ultimately comes from Ruth. Ultimately, it comes from a Moabite convert. And again, what allows for the Moabite convert to be accepted is the concept that the women were kind, and therefore they're allowed to be accepted. And the proof for the woman being kind is the story of Ruth. So that's the introduction number one. I think we'll open up the floor if anybody wants to share something on the introduction, and then we'll continue down in the story. Unmute all. If anybody wants to share.
Rabbi, I also thought it was interesting, as I recall, that King David not only comes from Ruth, but comes from Tamar. Is that correct?
Yes, you're taking me back in history. King David comes from another questionable union, not just Ruth and Boaz, but also earlier Judah himself, King David's ancestor. King David comes from Peretz, son of David, and he's born from the union between Judah and Tamar. At the time when Tamar was, Judah thought she was a harlot, so that's a complicated story as well. And it ties into the fact that the king has to come from the questionable union, and we'll discuss some of that as we continue.
Rabbi, the textual basis that you gave a few minutes ago, using the male plural rather than the female plural, isn't it the case in Hebrew that the male plural can also be used to include the female plural?
Correct. However, it's not the male plural that is given, it's the male singular.
Thank you.
Moabi, Moabi. Male singular. Male singular has to be specifically a male. Plural could include both. That's absolutely correct. Okay, so we continue down the journey. The only question is if you want more introductions, you want to go straight to the book. I don't know what people want. Okay, I'll give you one more introduction. Why not? There was a good friend of my grandfather when I was growing up in Crown Heights. His name was Alman Garari. He was a prominent member of the community. He came from a prominent family, and he was a wealthy businessman. So he got some honor, and wherever he came to an event, they would ask him to speak. And that's, of course, tricky because rabbis like to speak. So he used to say, in Yiddish, it works a little bit better. He says, before I start talking, I'm going to say a few words. So that was his thing. So one more introduction. So you look at Ruth, And we talked about Ruth's kindness, and we'll see it exemplified throughout the book. But the assumption is that Ruth's kindness is more than the usual measure. She goes beyond herself to the extreme. And now the question becomes, is that a value? Is that something good? Is that something good to sacrifice completely for somebody else, for your mother-in-law, for someone else? Or is it too extreme? And it's actually probably better to be more measured. In other words, more balanced. You take care of yourself, you take care of the other person. But Ruth seems to be going beyond the letter of the law in her kindness. And then the question becomes, if that's the case, and I think that is the case as we will read, the question becomes, is that a good thing? Is that a value that the Torah is highlighting? Is that what we're saying? This is what I should try to emulate and adapt into my life, not just kindness, but extreme kindness. In other words, extreme kindness means extreme humility. In other words, literally forgoing on one's own personal benefit in order to sacrifice for someone else's benefit. But giving up of oneself to that extreme, is that a value? Is that something good? So there are different theories. I'll give you one theory, is the political theory. The theory is that indeed, this is not the norm. This is not what the Torah requires for an average person. However, this is what the Torah requires from the king. In other words, Ruth is going to be the matriarch of the family of the monarchy. So we're saying in Judaism, what's the idea of a king? The idea of a king is someone who has more power, of course. Not all powerful. There's some degree of separation of powers. There's the court, there's the prophet, there's the king. But the point is, the king is, what is the proper king? The proper leader has to be one that sacrifices from himself for others more than other people. In other words, the proper leader is devoted to the community more than the average person. So the question is Ruth's behavior, is this demanded from the average person? Some say the answer is no. But if you're the king, and if you're taking the position of leadership, then you have additional responsibility. And your responsibility is to put the needs of others before the needs of yourself. So in other words, Ruth does sacrifice more than other people. And that is why she is chosen, her descendants are chosen to be the monarchs, because that is the quality that is demanded from a leader, right? In Judaism, leadership is not power per se, but like the Talmud says, the leadership is almost, you're serving the community. The Talmud quotes God as saying, I'm not giving you a srara, I'm not giving you ministership, I'm giving you avdut, I'm giving you service or slavery, and it's almost the same word. So in other words, yes, Ruth does go beyond the letter of the law with her kindness. She does completely give up her own needs for others. That is not necessarily the ideal. For the average person, you want to take the middle path, which is caring for others, but also keeping an eye on your own self-interests. Ruth does not seem to be taking care of her own interests. She consistently puts others before her. Is that the right thing? Maybe not, but it is the right thing if you want to establish the house of the monarchy. Not saying she was thinking about that, but it's interesting that that's the ingredient necessary for the monarchy. The monarchy, the more power you have, the more leadership you have, the more you have to put others before you. That at least is the perspective of Judaism. Did the Jewish kings, the house of David, always do it? No, but sometimes they did, and if they did, they got it from their great-grandmother, Ruth. Okay, enough introductions. We can give more introductions, but we'll give enough introductions. So I'm opening up. I sent the link, I think, in the email, but I'm opening up the Ruth in English, and I'm going to read just a few verses. So Neil asked, is it textual proof that David was Ruth-like, that David was humble? The good thing about David is we have his diary. In other words, we have his book of Psalms, and these are the songs he wrote. And if you look at the King David, you see this is not necessarily the way he's projected as a powerful warrior, which he was, but he's also a very sensitive soul and a very broken soul and a very humble soul. So if you want to see that part of David, you certainly look at his writings, and that's where you would see it. I'm sure there are other areas where you accept it in his life, but that is where you would see it. Again, when I make an introduction like this and I say this is what a person should be, a lot of what the Torah is doing is aspirational. In other words, nobody's going to be no one's going to be kind all the time. But the question is, what is the value that that Judaism is teaching? And the value is that the more power you have, the more kind, meaning the more devoted to the community you have to be. Whether or not you are is another story. That's free choice. But this is why this book is included, and this is why Ruth is highlighted in order to make this point, and set that as an example. So I think Jill wants to ask a question. So I think I'm going to unmute everybody. Go ahead.
It's really an observation, Rabbi, that when Naomi tells her daughters-in-law to go back, and she says to both of them, go back to your family and go back to your God. And it is Ruth that selects to go with her, with the assumption there that Ruth was a searcher, that she was a questioner, that the God that she came from was not acceptable. So I think that's a really good background for David. David, who is a questioner or a searcher, and that element hit me even more so than kindness. So
you're right. In this aspect, the aspect of her, in other words, there's a question, as we discuss the book, we're going to have to look at the motivations of Ruth. And it's not so clear. It's not, the Torah tells us stories, but the Torah doesn't necessarily dictate to us how to read the story and what's really happening. And sometimes we have to, like any piece of literature, we have to actually make educated guesses. So what's Ruth's primary motivation? Is it kindness or is it theology? And the answer is a little bit of both, but at least some of the commentaries explain you can't separate the two. In other words, you're right, there's an element of theology of searching for God, but if you follow the story, most of the story is about how even once she decides to accept Judaism, she does things that will perpetuate the family's legacy at the expense of her own well-being. So there's clearly kindness keeps resurfacing. I'm not saying that's the only value. Of course, she had an element of accepting the Jewish faith, but you can't separate that from the kindness, as we will discuss.
I have one question.
Yes.
So, like, you had taught us, like, if you love everybody, you love nobody, kind of. So,
Right.
like, these, like, I'm just making a current day example. These doctors and nurses that came from the West Coast or whatever to New York to help out with coronavirus, they were heroes, they were kind, they were humble, they were kind of like Ruth. But at the same time, they left their families. So, it's like, that's what I think about when you're talking about Ruth.
That is a very difficult question. In other words, do I have a responsibility to put to sacrifice for others and put my own family and the people closest to me at risk? And the answer is no, you don't have such a responsibility. In other words, this is going beyond the call of the law, and it has to be a calling. This has to come from you. It can't be superimposed from above. In other words, the Torah doesn't command you to put yourself in danger, but the Torah doesn't command you to put yourself in danger, but you have the right to. So it has to be a personal decision. It can't be dictated from the outside. But that's a serious question. How much do I care for others, and how much do I take care of myself? And forget about in other words, in addition to the dilemma of people in the healthcare, in healthcare, everybody really asks that question to themselves, because in your life, wherever you're going to be, there's a certain element of where you do for others, and there's a certain element where you have to take care of self, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and then finding the balance is not always so easy. Some people are more giving, some people are more focusing on self, but finding the balance is the difficult thing. But the balance has to be found. But the key is the more power I have. In other words, if I'm a leader, if I have more options, if I have, in the case of the king, if I have additional power, then I have to be able to be more devoted, right? I don't want to go here, but how do you determine whether somebody is a good leader? Don't look at the best place to see is to see how devoted he is to his people, not how much devotion he demands, but how devoted he is to his people. And that's the test. That's the test of leadership, at least from the Jewish perspective. Okay, so we're going back to the actual story. We're going to begin with the actual story. And the scene starts as follows. I'm first going to say it by heart, then we read a few verses inside, then we'll do a little bit of exploration. The scene starts that there's this family from Beit Lechem, from Judah, and there was this man. We don't know his name yet. Well, verse 2, we know his name. His name is Elimelech. And Elimelech leaves Judah because there's a famine. And where does he go? He goes to Moab, the land of Moab. That's verse 1 and 2. Verse 3, he dies. And then later his sons die as well. But we'll get to that later. So just from reading the story, he left the land of Israel. He comes to Moab and he dies. Why did he die? So the commentators are all saying, listen, from the proximity of these verses, the Torah is trying to allude to you that there's a sin here. And now the question is, what is the sin? Why did he die? In other words, is the Torah giving any indication why he died? So let me read the verses and then we'll see what happens. So I'm reading verse 1, Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. If you have it in the email, it's good. If not, it's okay. I'm just going to read 3 verses. Don't worry, you'll be able to hear. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges judged that there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem of Judah, and a man went from Bethlehem of Judah to sojourn in the fields of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So we'll talk about the opening statement. It was the days when the judges judged. What does it mean, the judges judged? It means there's no king. It's before the era of the kings. It was the era of the judges. There's in the Bible, right after the book of the Torah, you have the book of Joshua. After Joshua is Judges. What's Judges? There's no central leader. There's no strong leader. There's no king. There's no monarch. But there emerged within the Jewish people judges who were spiritual leaders. But at some point, they would also take up the political leadership when necessary. But there was no strong central authority. So this is in the era of the Judges. There's a famine in the land. A man goes from Bethlehem and he goes to the fields of Moab. Verse 2, the man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi. And his 2 sons' name was Machlon. His 2 sons' names were Machlon and Kilion. Ephrates. Ephrates means that they were from Ephrat, but really Ephrat means a distinguished people. Ephrat means a distinguished person. From Bethlehem of Judah, and they came to the fields of Moab, and they remained there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And this is a sad story, just to give you the heads up. His 2 daughters married 2 Moabite women. The two sons married 2 Moabite women. The sons die as well. They lose all their wealth. Oh, it doesn't say that they're wealthy. Okay, we'll get to that later. Say the rabbis, what happened here? What's the sin? Why did he die? Why did the kids die? What's happening here? So the Medrash says as follows. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So this is related to the day after Lag BaOmer, because this is a Medrash. The Talmud quotes Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which his passing was yesterday. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that this family, Elimelech and his 2 sons, Machlon and Kilion, they were Gedolei Hador Hayu. They were leaders of the generation. They were Parnasei Hador. They were a great distinguished people. Why were they punished? Because they left from Israel to outside of Israel. So that's what the Talmud says. The Talmud says there was a famine and they left Israel. Leaving Israel is the sin. Now, is leaving Israel a sin? What's so terrible to leave Israel? Is it a sin to leave Israel because of famine? So the Zohar asks a question. The Zohar says, 1 second, if you look at the Bible, Abraham also left Israel when there was a famine. Abraham comes to Israel and there's a famine in the land, and he goes to Egypt. Wonderful. So what's the problem? Abraham, even if it's a disagreement, if it's a sin, Ramban, Nachmanides says it is a sin. Others say it's not. He certainly wasn't punished. So why is Elimelech and Machlon and Kilion being held to a higher standard than King David, who also leaves Israel because of the famine? So the Zohar says very simple. The difference is that King David, when Abraham left Israel, he left from a place of wicked people. But when Elimelech was in Israel, the Jewish people were in Israel, he's leaving from amongst righteous people. So you leave from amongst righteous people, that is the sin. So that's one sin. He leaves Israel more of a spiritual sin. But then Rashi comes around, and the Rashi says a fascinating interpretation. Rashi says he was an extremely wealthy man. And because he was so wealthy, that's what led him to leave Israel. Because he was stingy. Meaning to say, there was a famine. So what happens when there was a famine? Everybody came to Elimelech for sustenance. So he says, I'm out of here. So in other words, it's not so much that he left Israel. That's one interpretation of the Talmud. But the question also is why he left Israel. And the answer is he left Israel because of the famine, not because he did not have any food, but because he did not want to support everybody else knocking on his door. That's what Rashi says. You know, the verse itself maybe does not support that 100%. So what we're going to do in a minute or two is we're going to try to find evidence for Rashi's interpretation in the text. But that's what Rashi is saying. In other words, we have here what seems to be a punishment. Just because the way the verses flow, he left Israel, he died. Something happened. It was a punishment. Why did he die? Well, Rashi says because he did not want to share. Okay, now, if you had to search for hints in the verse, right? Remember, all the verse says is there was a famine and they left. We don't know anything about the guy's bank account. We don't know about his tax brackets. We don't know how much he makes. So we have to find support for this thesis of Rashi that the reason why Elimelech leaves town is because he's too wealthy and he doesn't want to share his wealth with the other people who are starving. So where do we get that in the verse? So one theory is as follows. One theory is we know why he left, but the question is where did he go? And going to Moab indicates that he's a wealthy man. Why? Because where do you go? If you're in Israel, there's a famine. Where do you go? Why is there a famine in Israel? Because it doesn't rain. Well, I have a secret to tell you. If you look at the weather report this morning, you'll see that if it doesn't rain in Israel, it's not raining in Moab either. Moab is literally across the Jordan across the Jordan River from Israel. So if there's no rain in Israel, there's no rain in Jordan. So going to Jordan is not going to help you. Going to Moab is not going to help you. Where do you go in Israel if there's a famine and there's no rain? Of course, you do what Abraham did. You go to Egypt. Why do you go to Egypt? Because Egypt doesn't need the rain. Why doesn't it need the rain? Because its sustenance is from the Nile. And the Nile comes from Central Africa. So there's plenty of rain over there. So if you are hungry because of a famine, you pick up your bags and you did exactly what Abraham did, and you go to Egypt. But Elimelech doesn't go to Egypt. He just leaves his people. He crosses the Jordan. It's not a long trek from Beit Lechem to the Jordan River. He crosses the Jordan. He's in Moab, which means he's not looking for food. He's got plenty of food. That's one hint. Another hint is if you look at the people of Moab, they're not known to be kind. They're not known to be hospitable to strangers. So if you're hungry and you're looking for support and you're looking to be accepted in society and you're looking to start up a new life, Moab is not the place you want to go. So what's the indication? The indication is that Elimelech travels to Moab, not Elimelech Elimelech travels to Moab not because he's hungry, but because he's trying to get away from the poor Jews. Neil asks, does he travel in the direction of Jacob? He goes the opposite direction, right? He goes the opposite direction. He's going from, yes, he is tracking that way, but going the opposite direction. Now we know that, but again, there's a history in that part of the land where there's famine all the time because the rain is not common, it's scarce. Not in Israel last couple of years, thank God it's raining. The Kinneret is going way up to its historical heights. They don't know what to do with so much water, thank God. But that doesn't always happen. Now, yes, so if you're fleeing Jacob, when Jacob leaves Israel, he's not leaving because of a famine, A. Second of all, he's not going to Moab. He's going to Baghdad. He's going to Aram Naharaim, where there's plenty of water there. So that's a separate discussion. Now the question is, all we know about from the verse is there's a famine, and the famine motivated the move. So there's either two possibilities. either Elimelech was hungry and that's why he moved. But if that's the case, it's not logical that he would go to Moab for the two reasons I mentioned. Number one, it doesn't rain in Moab if it doesn't rain in Israel. Number two, Moab are not hospitable people. So if you're hungry, you do what Abraham did and you do what Isaac did. Whenever there's a famine, Jacob did only because of a famine. Whenever there's a famine in the Bible, you go to Egypt. That's what you do. When the brothers, Jacob's sons also went to Egypt when there was a famine. You never go to Moab when there's a famine. If there's a famine, you go straight to Egypt. So that's the indication for Rashi's interpretation that he left because he's tzarayin, he's a stingy, he has wealth. He doesn't want to spend his wealth on his people, so he checks out of town. So that's one point. Now, so we're going to conclude with this point. I'll make one final point, and then we'll conclude, and we'll pick up next Tuesday, God willing, at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then hopefully next Wednesday, and we'll continue. But one final point. If you look at the history of the Jewish people, history of leadership, you will see that early on, Jacob blesses his son Judah and says Judah will be the leader. Yet Judah was not a leader. Judah's family was not a leader for hundreds of years, all throughout the periods of the judges. And then even once there was a king, the first monarch was not from the house of David. The first monarch was Saul, Shaul from the house of Benjamin. Only with David did Judah attain the leadership. So the question is, part of the subtle story here is, why isn't Judah the leader here? Why don't we find that there's strong leadership in the house in Israel from the house of Judah? And the answer is this story. The answer is because we just finished explaining earlier that a leader has to be devoted to his people. What does Elimelech do? And it's not just him. That represents the attitude of his tribe, the attitude of his people. They were very prominent people. They were very wealthy, so they should have been leaders. But the moment there's challenge, the moment there was difficulty, and they have to give to others, they check out. So that is sort of a moral stain on the leadership qualities of Judah. And therefore, Judah himself at this point, Judah's family themselves at this point, are not leaders because they don't stand up to the challenge of leadership. Only later, when Ruth comes into the family, and Ruth brings the ideal of kindness, that's when Judah could return to become the leader. So that's it for today, I think. We said 45 minutes. I'd like to go over, but not too much over, because then nobody's going to come back. Oh, 10:45, exactly. Look at that. So just to summarize quickly, what are the points we talked about? We talked about the introduction. We talked about what's the purpose of the book. We talked about the purpose of the book is to highlight the kindness and to highlight King David's lineage. And we say these two are interconnected, because if the Moabite women are not kind, that undermines their ability to enter the Jewish people. So David being a legitimate Jew and then a legitimate king is predicated on the fact that we believe that the Moabite women are kind. So we need the book, we need the story to proclaim that kindness and make that point. That was one introduction. Then we discussed the introduction about how much does a person require to sacrifice from oneself? How do you balance your own needs with the needs of the community, of others? And Ruth goes to the extreme. She consistently puts other people before her. The question was that a good thing? It's certainly a tricky question, but the answer is it's not necessarily demanded of everybody. But if you want the position of leadership, this is a quality of leadership. The quality of a leader is not that he's so charismatic or so influential. The quality of a leader, not or inspires people to follow him, that's not leadership. Leadership is how much the leader is willing to sacrifice for the people. So this part of Ruth's personality is not necessarily, does everybody have to emulate that, but the king, the monarch, certainly has to emulate that. And then we started discussing the actual story. What about Elimelech? What caused him to leave? And we say the failure is not so much that he left Israel, even though that's part of it, according to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It's why he left Israel. He left Israel because he does not want to share his wealth with others, and that's why he goes to the place of Moab. Again, and the textual source for that is the fact that he goes to Moab instead of to go if he was hungry. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening, and